Hi everyone, welcome back after the break. So in this section, Andrew and I are gonna discuss some of the savings options or service cuts to services that are being proposed by the mayor in his budget. So I'm gonna let Andrew talk about a large portion of it, which is to do with the library service. Now, Andrew, you've actually spoke on that on recently at an event led by the union. So do you want to just talk about what those actual cuts mean in terms of members of the public, in terms of the libraries or their access to the libraries, and what it actually means for those communities? I know that you were concerned by the Isle of Dogs, and the Isle of Dogs just has one library, which is Cubitt Town Library, that serves that entire area. So do you want to talk about?
Yeah, so there's a sort of campaign that's kind of formed and involves the unions, because the proposals were originally and still are talking about, I think, roughly sort of 35 job losses. There's then the actual changes to the libraries themselves, which obviously affect sort of kind of local residents as well. So there's kind of been a campaign organised by some people. So what happened was, so at the end of last year, the council made some proposals to save about £1.6 million from library services. And what they were proposing at that point in time was to close completely Cubitt Town Library, to reduce the hours of Bethnal Green Library to, I think, about 15 hours a week. Watney Street Market to also reduce hours to, again, about 15 hours a week. And that the other Ideas stores would sort of have reduced hours on Sundays, so going from, I think, 6 down to 4 hours. There was then a consultation. Lots of people responded. I think about 700-800 people responded to that consultation. Obviously, the unions have got involved. So a couple of days ago, the cabinet papers came out for next Wednesday, and the council are proposing something different from the first proposal. And they're kind of offering kind of two options. So the first option basically would be pretty similar to what I just said, but some slightly longer hours for Bethnal Green and Watney Market. But for Cubitt Town Library, rather than closing completely, it reopened for 2 days of the week for a total of 16 hours. But that would still save £1.6 million. And then basically what they were going to do is reduce the amount of evening staff cover at the Ideas stores for the rest of the week to kind of pay for that. The second option they're looking at only saves £1.5 million. And that's pretty similar, but that would allow Cubitt Town Library to also open on a Saturday as well. So they're kind of gone from completely closing Cubitt down to it's sort of rather than being 6 days a week, it might be 2 or maybe 3 days a week that's open, which obviously is welcome. But both options still result in major job cuts. So I know the unions, and I had a chat with them earlier. Obviously they like the fact that Cubitt Town stays open, but they're still concerned about the job losses. And one of the proposals in the 12 Labour councillors' letter was to reverse completely the library savings. And that was also something that we were aimed at, because one of our concerns on the Isle of Dogs is, I don't know if you looked in our direction recently, but there's lots of, big, tall residential towers, and people are moving into them like now. And we may have lost Tiller Road Leisure Centre. We were going to lose the library. So it's really odd. You've got all these new people, massive population growth, and actually the services are kind of being cut back. And I forgot to say, and if you're in Whitechapel, you don't have to worry, because you're going to have a new library. So as part of all of these changes, is the council are actually also proposing a brand new library in the town hall in Whitechapel, and keep the existing reference library in Whitechapel. So Whitechapel would have 2 libraries, and us poor people on the Isle of Dog, and there are lots of poor people on the Isle of Dogs, by the way, would lose our library. We'd still have the Canary Wharf Ideas store, but it's not that accessible for residents. It's the smallest of the Ideas stores, and it's not ideally situated either. So it looks like there's been some improvement, I think, thanks to the consultation responses. And I think also the quality impact assessment on the libraries, I think, was also, if you've heard us speaking about those issues, was also, I think, influential in changing the council's mind on this one as well. But it still involves, big changes in the library service. So, and I know the unions will also have something to say about this on Thursday night as well.
No, but they're still sticking to the financial plan. So it's a small victory, but it still leaves a bit of uncertainty. Do you think the future of Cubic Town is guaranteed, or do you see that library eventually up for the chop, so to speak, and we just end up with one central library in Tower Hamlets? Is that where you think the direction is going?
So our concern about the 2 days a week is that's just setting it up to fail, because then like people just forget which days it's open, and therefore it'll just get cut at some point in the future. In theory, what's supposed to happen is if the Asda site gets redeveloped, then in theory on that site would be a new sort of public facility. And then what would happen is that the Canary Wharf Ideas Store and Cubic Town Library would both move into that new big facility at Asda, and then basically would have one big library on the Isle of Dogs. But Asda doesn't yet have planning permission. This is like the fourth attempt in 15 years, I think, to do something on that site. The previous attempts never quite worked out. And even if it were to get planning permission this year, and even if it were to go ahead, probably 6 years before that new facility be ready anyway.
No. It's an amazing campaign, and I know there was a petition out, and there was an event. I want to slightly move the topic away from the other large area of cuts, which is cuts to the public health budget, which is to do with drug treatment, and it's an issue that's not talked about in Tower Hamlets. It's probably due to the kind of individuals who benefit from the service, those kind of demographics who just fall through the cracks of our public institution. But there are deep cuts to that service, and just looking at the savings proposals, there's a £450,000 deduction from the substance misuse service, and there's the decommissioning of the Royal London Hospital Violence Reduction Project Health, which is another £102,000. But just looking at the public health budget overall on the MTFS, they're expected to deliver more cuts in second and third year. And I just want to give the context of what it means in Tower Hamlets. Tower Hamlets has one of the highest number of heroin and crack cocaine users, and the last statistics we've had on the issue, we've got the equivalent of about 3,200. That's for every 100,000 population, that's 14.4 people are either a heroin user or a crack cocaine user, and it has impact on other aspects, on their family lives. I've come across many families who've got an individual who's got a drug problem, and it causes issues along that. There's issues with regards to children growing up with parents who have a drug or drink problem. When it comes to domestic violence and violence within the home, that's one of the trigger points, etc., etc. And obviously, it leads habitual users of drugs basically commit petty crime as well, and a lot of the antisocial behavior in the borough is related to and violent crime is related to the drug trade as well. And my concern is that what studies have shown is that whenever there's been an increase in poverty, say a rise in unemployment or financial stress in a population, it kind of like edges people towards either drink or drug issues. And it seems like in a time when we're basically facing economic uncertainty and a lot of people losing their jobs, is it a time to actually cut a service where we're going to have an increase demand? And I just want to give an example. There's been a spike in domestic violence incidences during the lockdown. It's to do with people not having jobs, being stressed out, etc. And we in the courts, we had to basically set up a court just specifically dealing with domestic violence cases at Thames Magistrates, and that just shows you how big the problem is. And is it the right time to actually cut a service where we're possibly anticipating an increased demand on the use of that service? And just to give an example, what the drug service does is the ones I come across from Tower Hamlets is the officers go into the police cells, they speak to individuals who are arrested, and say, do you want to come off drugs? If they say yes, then they engage with them and put them on a program and help them get off and start rebuilding their lives. Andrew, do you want to give your thoughts on that? Is it wise to basically cut a service where we're possibly anticipating an increased demand on it? It's not a popular service, not one that people talk about, but it's one that's needed in Tower Hamlets.
So I think that there's lots of services that the council provide that people, most people in the ordinary public just would not be aware of until kind of things go wrong. I mean, one of the things to make a point about the sort of public health grant. So the public health grant is about £35 million. And in theory, you can't cut it because it's a ring-fence grant from government for public health. But what you can do, which is what I think is sort of happening here, is how do you define public health? And one of the things that you can do is things that might have used to be spent in a general fund, which is the main pot of money, is you can kind of categorize some of that as being kind of public health. And therefore, you can cut things in public health, but you then have to replace that money with other spend. So to give you, an example, trying to see if I can find the page. So, for example, the substance misuse service is being cut by £450,000, but they're going to spend on physical activity and sports £440,000. So it's almost a one-for-one kind of replacement. But physical activity and sports is the kind of stuff that was done by the leisure centres. So the question is, where was that budget before? Is that a new budget, or are we simply just moving money around, and cutting back what is proper, depending on what your definition is of proper public health spend?
No, it is, and it just, and that's why it's in a time of uncertainty, because once you cut that service back, it's very difficult to build up because you've got officers with years of experience, etc., and it's not something that you could basically build back. So we're going to go into a break. We'll probably continue slightly with this discussion and then move on to Q&A from listeners. But join us after the break.